Story 13. My grandfather's attic was a place I'd rarely visited. It was one of those spaces that held years of forgotten memories, packed tight with dusty boxes and old furniture. After he passed away, I was tasked with clearing it out, sorting through the clutter, and deciding what to keep. I wasn't expecting to find much, maybe some old trinkets or forgotten books, but what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the rafters. I climbed up the rickety ladder, dust swirling around me as I reached the top. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and decaying paper. Boxes were piled high, some of them stacked so precariously that I had to be careful not to knock them over. I started with the smaller boxes, sorting through old clothes, newspapers, and faded letters. Most of it was mundane, the kind of stuff you'd expect to find in an attic. But then I found the box of photographs. It was tucked away in the corner, covered with a layer of dust so thick I had to wipe it off with my sleeve. The box was unremarkable, just a simple cardboard container, but the photographs inside were anything but ordinary. At first, they seemed like typical family photos. There were pictures of my grandparents when they were young, smiling at the camera in their Sunday best. There were shots of family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays. But as I sifted through them, I came across a set of photographs that made my heart skip a beat. They were black and white, clearly from decades ago. But the subject of the photos was a man who looked just like me. The resemblance was uncanny, same facial structure, same hair color, even the same dimple in his cheek when he smiled. It was like looking into a mirror, but these photos were dated long before I was born. I felt a chill run down my spine as I examined the photographs. There was no mistaking it, the man in the photos could have been my twin. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a suit and tie that looked like it was from the 1940s or 50s. He was in various settings in front of a house, at a park, sitting on a bench by a river, but each photo had the same eerie familiarity. I turned the photographs over, searching for any clues. Some had dates written on the back, all from the mid-20th century, but there were no names, no identifying information. I checked the other photos in the box, hoping to find a connection, but there was nothing. It was as if this man had been erased from our family history, leaving behind only these haunting images. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was a mystery here that needed solving. I took the photos downstairs and showed them to my parents, hoping they might have some answers. But they were just as confused as I was. My father swore he'd never seen the man before, and my mother suggested it might be a distant relative, someone who bore a striking resemblance to me. But I couldn't accept that explanation. The resemblance was too strong, too exact. I decided to dig deeper, to see if I could find any records or documents that might shed light on who this man was and why he looked just like me. I spent hours searching through old family albums, digging through the attic, and even asking distant relatives if they knew anything about him. But I came up empty-handed. The more I searched, the more obsessed I became. I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs, about the man who seemed to share my face but had lived decades before I was born. I started to have dreams about him, vivid images of him walking through the same places I did, his presence like a shadow that followed me everywhere. One night, I had a particularly vivid dream. I was in my grandfather's attic, but it was different, cleaner, brighter, like it had been restored to its former glory. The man from the photographs was there, standing in the corner, his back to me. I called out to him, asking who he was, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed toward the window, where the moonlight streamed in through the dusty glass. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream felt so real, so immediate, that I couldn't shake the sense of urgency. I returned to the attic, retracing my steps, hoping to find something I'd missed. And then I saw at the window, partially obscured by boxes, with a small latch at the bottom. I moved the boxes aside and opened the window, the old hinges creaking as I pushed it open. There was a small ledge outside, barely wide enough to stand on, but I could see something tucked into the corner. It was a small envelope, weathered and yellowed with age. I reached out and grabbed it, feeling a surge of anticipation as I carefully opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. It was a letter, written in the same handwriting I'd seen on the back of the photographs. It was from my grandfather, addressed to my future grandson. The letter was short, but it explained everything. The man in the photographs was his twin brother, a brother he never spoke of, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The letter hinted at a family secret, a rift that had torn the brothers apart, but it didn't go into detail. I felt a mix of relief and sadness as I read the letter. The mystery of the man in the photographs was solved, but it left me with more questions than answers. What had happened to my great-uncle? Why had my grandfather never mentioned him? And what was this secret that had caused such a deep rift in the family? I knew I had to dig deeper to uncover the truth behind my family's history. The photographs, the letter, and the dreams, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I was determined to solve. I would not let my great-uncle's memory fade into obscurity, and I would uncover the secrets that had been hidden for far too long. The attic had opened a door to the past, and I was ready to step through it, no matter what I might find on the other side. Story 14. The subway was my preferred way to get home from work. It was efficient, usually on time, and gave me a chance to decompress after a long day. I usually kept my head down, earbuds in, trying to blend into the crowd. But that night everything felt off. It started with a man in a long coat standing at the far end of the platform, watching me intently. At first I thought he was just another commuter, but his gaze never wavered, even as the crowd shifted and moved. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the music in my ears, but I could feel his eyes on me. The train arrived and I stepped into the crowded car, hoping he would stay behind. But he followed, positioning himself at the opposite end, his coat brushing the floor as he leaned against the metal pole. I couldn't make out his features. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but I could sense his focus on me, as if he were studying my every move. The train rumbled through the tunnels, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I glanced around, hoping to find someone else watching him, someone else noticing how out of place he seemed. But the other passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, staring at their phones. No one seemed to notice the man in the long coat. My usual stop was coming up, and I decided to get off, thinking he would continue on with the train. I stepped onto the platform, the familiar smell of oil and damp concrete filling the air. But as I glanced back, I saw him stepping off too, his long coat sweeping behind him as he moved through the crowd. I felt a surge of fear, wondering why he was following me. I walked quickly, weaving through the throngs of people heading for the exits. I took a different route than usual, hoping to lose him in the crowd. But when I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping his distance but never losing sight of me. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, but I was the one being hunted. I decided to confront him, to turn around and demand to know why he was following me. I spun on my heels, ready to face him, but he was gone. The platform was crowded, but he had vanished, disappearing into the sea of people. I felt a chill run down my spine, wondering how he could have vanished so quickly. As I stood there, catching my breath, I noticed something on the ground. A small envelope, lying just a few feet from where I'd turned around. It was plain, with my name written in large, bold letters across the front. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned it over. There was no return address, no postmark, just my name, scrawled in thick black ink. I opened the envelope, my heart racing, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a handwritten note, brief but direct. "You shouldn't have come here. Leave before it's too late." The words sent a shiver down my spine, each letter sharp and jagged, as if written in haste. I looked around, expecting to see the man in the long coat watching from the shadows, but there was no sign of him. The platform was bustling with people, but I felt utterly alone, as if I were the only one who knew something was wrong. I knew I had to leave, to get out of the subway and find a safe place to think. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell. The words of the note repeated in my mind, each repetition adding to my sense of urgency. I reached the street, the city lights casting a harsh glow, and I blended into the crowd, hoping to lose myself among the pedestrians. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the man in the long coat following me. But he was nowhere to be seen, as if he'd vanished into thin air. I found a coffee shop, a small place with dim lighting and quiet corners, and I took a seat by the window, my back against the wall. I knew I needed to figure out who the man was and why he'd left me that note. The warning was clear, but it raised more questions than it answered. What was I supposed to leave? The subway? The city? And why was it too late? I felt a surge of frustration, the uncertainty gnawing at me like a persistent itch. I decided to go to the police, to show them the note and explain what had happened. But as I reached into my pocket, the envelope and the note were gone. I searched my pockets, the floor beneath the table, even the path I took to get to the coffee shop, but there was no sign of it. It was as if the warning had never existed, as if it had been a figment of my imagination. The rest of the night was a blur, the fear and confusion overwhelming my thoughts. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the man in the long coat and the cryptic message he left behind. I knew I had to be cautious, to watch my back, because someone out there knew who I was and didn't want me to stay. The city no longer felt safe, the familiar streets now filled with shadows and hidden threats. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man in the long coat was out there, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I was no longer just another commuter, I was a target, and I had to find out why before it was too late. Story 15. The old mansion was an architectural marvel, a relic of a bygone era with ornate woodwork and towering stone facades. My crew had been hired to renovate the place, to bring it back to life after decades of neglect. The mansion had a reputation in town, with stories of hidden passages and ghostly apparitions. Most people brushed it off as folklore, but the truth was even more unsettling. We'd been working on the ground floor, tearing down old plaster and reinforcing the structure. The dust was thick in the air, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the empty halls. It was hard work, but we were used to it. The mansion was full of surprises, hidden compartments in the walls, secret staircases leading to nowhere, but nothing prepared us for what we found behind the false wall. It was during the afternoon shift. We were working in what used to be the library, a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive fireplace at one end. As we removed a section of the wall, one of the workers noticed a hollow sound when he struck a particular spot. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to pique our curiosity. We cleared away the plaster and found a seam, a thin line where the wall met the floor. It was a hidden door, cleverly disguised to look like part of the structure. We pried it open, expecting to find a storage closet or maybe an old passageway, but what we discovered was far more disturbing. The room was small, barely large enough to stand in. It had no windows, no light fixtures, just stacks of missing person posters piled high against the walls. They were old, yellowed with age, but the faces on the posters were hauntingly familiar. They were people from town, individuals who had vanished without a trace over the years. I recognized some of the names, stories that had made headlines and then faded into obscurity. But what sent chills down my spine was the message scrawled across the top of each poster. "I know where they are." The words were written in bold, jagged letters, as if they were etched into the paper with a shaky hand. The message was clear, but its meaning was cryptic, raising more questions than answers. We stood there, staring at the stacks of posters, unsure of what to do. The room felt like a tomb, a place where secrets had been buried and forgotten. I picked up one of the posters and examined it closely. The photo was of a young woman, her smile frozen in time, her eyes full of life. The date on the poster was from a decade ago, but the message across the top seemed fresh, as if someone had written it just recently. I knew we had to report it, to call the authorities and let them handle it, but something held me back, a nagging feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. The hidden room, the missing person posters, the cryptic message, it all felt like part of a larger puzzle, one that I was determined to solve. I took a few of the posters with me, tucking them into my tool belt as we left the hidden room. The rest of the crew continued with the renovation, but I couldn't stop thinking about the message. "I know where they are." Who had written it? And why had they hidden these posters behind a false wall? That night I did some research, looking up the names from the posters. Each one had a story, a history that had been forgotten over time. There were newspaper articles, police reports, and online forums dedicated to the missing. But no one had any answers, no leads that pointed to what had happened to them. I knew I had to dig deeper, to find out who had left the message and why. I returned to the mansion after hours, the place eerily silent without the sound of construction. I made my way back to the hidden room, flashlight in hand, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As I entered the room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small piece of paper tucked between the stacks of posters. It was a note, handwritten, but the words were smeared, as if someone had tried to erase them. I could only make out a few words. "They are here. Basement. Don't tell." I felt a surge of fear, the implications of the note sinking in. The basement of the mansion was a labyrinth, a network of rooms and corridors that had long been sealed off. If the missing people were down there, if the message was a clue to their whereabouts, then I had to find out for myself. I descended into the basement, my flashlight casting a dim glow in the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, the walls damp and crumbling. As I explored the maze of corridors, I heard faint sounds like whispers carried on the wind. It was unsettling, the feeling of being watched, as if the walls themselves had eyes. I followed the sounds, my heart racing, until I reached a locked door at the end of a narrow passageway. The lock was old, rusted, but I managed to pry it open with my crowbar. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a small room filled with old furniture and broken crates. But what caught my attention was the faint outline of a trapdoor in the floor. I opened the trapdoor, the smell of damp earth wafting up from below. A narrow staircase led down into darkness, the steps slick with moisture. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that whatever was down there might be more than I could handle. But the words of the message echoed in my mind. "I know where they are." I couldn't turn back now, not without finding out the truth. With a deep breath, I descended into the darkness, my flashlight flickering as I made my way down the narrow staircase. The basement held its secrets, and I was about to uncover them, no matter the cost. Each step down the staircase felt like a journey into another realm. The air was thicker here, a mixture of dampness and something else, something metallic and raw. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting beams of light on the rough stone walls. The whispers I'd heard earlier grew louder, becoming more distinct, but I couldn't make out any words. It was like a chorus of lost voices, overlapping and blending into a haunting symphony. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a narrow corridor that stretched out in both directions. The walls were lined with old pipes, some of which were corroded and leaking, creating small puddles on the floor. The corridor was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs, but the light barely pierced the darkness ahead. I chose to turn left, feeling my way along the damp walls, my flashlight casting shaky circles of light. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the bowels of the mansion. I passed by rusted doors, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of forgotten storage rooms filled with broken furniture and discarded items. But then I reached a door that was different from the others. It was larger, with a heavy iron handle, and it was locked with a massive padlock. The lock was old and rusted, but it still seemed sturdy. I felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing that whatever lay behind this door was important. I used my crowbar to pry the lock open, the metal groaning in protest before it finally snapped. The door swung open, revealing a larger room with a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with metal shelves, and on those shelves were rows of glass jars filled with murky liquid. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the contents of the jar's specimens, preserved in formaldehyde. There were various body parts, some human, others animal, all carefully labeled with handwritten tags. I felt a wave of nausea, the realization of what I was seeing hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a forgotten storage room, this was a laboratory, a place where someone had been conducting experiments, horrific experiments that seemed to blend human and animal elements. The jars were filled with grotesque amalgamations, limbs with claws, faces with fangs, all suspended in a sickly greenish hue. As I backed away, I noticed a table at the far end of the room. It was covered with papers, yellowed with age, and a single photograph sat atop the pile. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned it over. It was a picture of a group of people, scientists, by the looks of their lab coats, standing outside the mansion. They were all smiling, but there was something unsettling about their expressions, a sense of twisted satisfaction. I scanned the rest of the papers, finding handwritten notes detailing the experiments, the goals, and the outcomes. The notes spoke of creating a new breed of being, a perfect blend of human intelligence and animal strength. The experiments had started decades ago, but the latest entries were far more recent, suggesting that someone had continued the work long after the original scientists had vanished. As I stood there, piecing together the horrifying reality of what had happened in this hidden laboratory, I heard a noise from the corridor. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the direction I had come. I felt a surge of panic, knowing that I wasn't alone in this dark, twisted place. The footsteps grew louder, the sound echoing off the stone walls, and I knew I had to hide. I ducked behind one of the shelves, my flashlight turned off, my breath shallow and silent. The footsteps entered the room, a figure silhouetted by the dim light from the corridor. I couldn't make out their features, but they were tall, wearing a long coat, their movements deliberate and controlled. They walked slowly through the room, their eyes scanning the shelves, as if searching for something or someone. I held my breath. The papers crumpled in my fist, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure continued to move, their footsteps soft but menacing, each step a reminder that I was in the belly of the beast. I knew that if they found me, there would be no escape, no way to explain my presence in this secret laboratory. But then, as suddenly as they had entered, they left, their footsteps fading down the corridor. I waited, my body tense, listening for any sign of their return. When I was sure the coast was clear, I slipped out from behind the shelf and made my way back to the door, my flashlight guiding me through the darkness. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step feeling like an eternity, the sounds of the mansion's hidden laboratory echoing in my ears. I reached the ground floor, the sense of normalcy returning, but I knew that what I had uncovered was far from normal. The hidden room, the missing person posters, the grotesque experiments, it was all part of a dark and twisted legacy, one that I was determined to expose. I left the mansion, the papers clutched tightly in my hand, and I knew that my renovation project was over. There was no turning back now. I would take what I had found to the authorities, to the police, to anyone who would listen. The mansion held its secrets, but I had seen enough to know that those secrets needed to be brought to light, no matter the cost.